In the early 1970s, Chile was not simply a country under pressure. It was a system approaching operational collapse under its own complexity. Inflation was accelerating beyond control. Supply chains fractured not from lack of resources, but from lack of coordination. Factories slowed not because they could not produce, but because they no longer knew what to produce. And beneath all of it was a deeper failure, a failure of visibility. A government can tolerate scarcity. It can tolerate unrest. It can even tolerate political instability. But what it can't tolerate for long is delay, because delay transforms governance into guesswork. And Chile, at this moment in history, was governed almost entirely through delayed information. Orders moved through layers of bureaucracy. Reports traveled through paperwork chains that stretched across ministries. And by the time economic data reached decision makers, it no longer described the present, only the past. The country was not blind. It was simply navigating through a delayed reflection of itself. And in complex systems, delayed perception is indistinguishable from no perception at all. Factories would stop not because demand disappeared, but because the signal arrived too late. Cargo would sit idle not because logistics failed, but because coordination lagged behind reality. And the entire national economy began to behave like a system out of sync with its own feedback loop. This is where most historical accounts begin with politics. But the real failure was structural, not ideological, not moral, but informational. A nation trying to operate without real-time awareness of itself. And when a system cannot see itself clearly, it begins to behave unpredictably. Small inefficiencies amplify into cascading disruptions. Local delays become national crises, and uncertainty becomes the dominant force shaping every decision. Into this environment arrived an unusual figure, a man who did not think like a politician or an economist or even a traditional engineer. Stafford Beer, a British cybernetician. Beer saw nations not as political entities, but as living systems. To him, the language of government was too slow, too fragmented, too disconnected from reality. He believed something radical, that a country could be understood as a self-regulating organism. Factories were not isolated units. They were organs in a larger body. Transportation systems were circulation. Communication networks were the nervous system. And Chile, in his assessment, was experiencing neurological lag, not political failure, not economic collapse, but a breakdown in the speed of its internal signaling. Beer proposed something that, at the time, sounded almost impossible. Not more bureaucracy, not more centralized control, but the opposite, a distributed system of real-time feedback. A national intelligence layer that could sense production, distribution, and shortages as they occurred, not weeks later. This was not a computer system in the modern sense. Computers in the early 1970s were large, centralized, and slow by today's standards. They were not capable of continuous national simulation. So Beer's idea did not rely on computational power alone. It relied on structure, a hybrid system, human decision makers embedded inside a machine-assisted feedback network, factories reporting conditions through telex machines, regional centers feeding information into a central coordination layer, and a government capable of reacting not to reports of reality, but to reality itself. The system had a name, Project Cybersyn, At its core was a philosophical claim that bordered on the radical. A nation could only be governed effectively if it could perceive itself in real time, not symbolically, not statistically, but continuously, as a living, updating system. The implications of this idea were enormous, because it implied that most governmental failure was not caused by bad decisions, but by delayed perception. Cybersyn did not look like what most people imagine when they hear computer system. It did not begin with screens or keyboards. It began with infrastructure, hundreds of telex machines installed across factories throughout Chile. These machines were slow, mechanical, limited in bandwidth, but they were reliable. And reliability mattered more than speed, because consistency of signal was more important than volume. Each factory reported key metrics: production levels, shortages, equipment failures, resource constraints. These reports flowed into a centralized coordination structure. But unlike traditional bureaucracies, the goal was not accumulation of reports. It was immediate interpretation and rapid feedback. At the heart of Cybersyn was its most iconic and misunderstood component, the operations room, a circular space designed not as a control center but as a cognitive environment. White modular chairs arranged in a ring, a central visualization system displaying national industrial conditions, not as numbers, but as dynamic states of stability and stress. Green signals indicated stability. Yellow indicated pressure. Red indicated systemic risk. This was not aesthetic design. It was cognitive compression, a deliberate attempt to transform economic complexity into human intuition, to allow decision makers to see the state of the economy without translation through spreadsheets or reports. Every design choice in that room was aimed at reducing decision latency, because in a system under pressure, the time between perception and action is the most valuable resource. Elsewhere in Chile, the telex network continued to expand. Factories that had never previously communicated directly were now part of a shared informational loop. A steel plant could report shortages that would influence distribution decisions in another region. A textile factory could signal delays that would affect national planning. For the first time, the economy was not just being managed. It was being observed as a unified system, and systems that are observed begin to change their behavior. Sometimes they stabilize, sometimes they accelerate, but they always respond, because feedback changes the nature of control. As Cybersyn expanded, it began to behave less like a project and more like an organism. Information flowed continuously. Decisions became faster. Coordination improved in real time. And for the first time in Chile's modern history, parts of the economy began to synchronize. But synchronization is fragile, because it depends on uninterrupted feedback, and reality rarely remains stable for long. In 1972, that stability was tested. A major logistical crisis emerged in the form of a truckers' strike. Transportation networks began to fragment. Distribution channels slowed. Entire regions faced shortages as goods failed to move. Under traditional governance, this would have taken days to assess. By the time data arrived, the situation would already have changed. But Cybersyn compressed that delay. Reports from across the country began to arrive through the telex network. Factories reporting halted shipments, regional centers signaling shortages, critical supply chains showing stress in real time. Inside the operations structure, operators began to adjust flows dynamically, redirecting resources, reprioritizing distribution, identifying bottlenecks as they formed rather than after they collapsed. For a brief and unprecedented moment, something remarkable occurred. A national-scale system began responding faster than the crisis itself was evolving. Not perfectly, not completely, but measurably. And in complex systems, speed is not just efficiency, it is survival. For the first time, it appeared that a national economy could behave not as a reactive bureaucracy, but as a self-correcting system, a living organism adjusting to stress in real time. Systems that gain responsiveness also gain visibility. And visibility creates friction, because not all actors benefit from transparency. Not all systems welcome feedback, and not all forms of control are compatible with real-time awareness. A system that sees itself clearly begins to expose inefficiencies that were previously hidden, and exposed inefficiencies create resistance. Not just technical resistance, but political resistance, economic resistance, institutional resistance. Because feedback does not only optimize systems, it reveals them. What it reveals is not always comfortable. By 1973, Chile had become a highly polarized environment. Political tensions escalated, external pressures intensified, and Cybersyn, once an experimental infrastructure project, became entangled in forces far larger than itself. Then came the coup, a sudden rupture in the political system. The government that had supported Cybersyn was overthrown, and with it, the system that had been quietly transforming national coordination was dismantled. The operations room was abandoned, telex networks were shut down, infrastructure was physically destroyed or repurposed. But this moment is often misunderstood in simplified histories. It was not merely the end of a project. It was the removal of an emerging feedback architecture from an entire nation. And when feedback is removed from a complex system, the system does not become stable. It becomes opaque again, blind to itself. Cybersyn did not fail because it was flawed. It did not collapse under technical limitations. It was interrupted before it could fully mature, cut off mid-evolution, before its experimental phase could become systemic reality. The operations room, once a symbol of a possible future, became a frozen artifact of a path not taken. But systems do not disappear cleanly. They leave traces, and traces persist longer than structures. Decades later, the world began to reconstruct similar principles, though without reference to Cybersyn. Logistics networks became increasingly real-time. Global supply chains evolved into continuously optimized systems. Warehouses became predictive environments rather than static storage facilities. Distribution systems began adjusting dynamically to demand signals. Amazon does not simply store products. It simulates demand patterns continuously. Google does not simply retrieve information. It models attention at scale. Modern AI systems do not simply respond to queries. They adjust outputs based on probabilistic prediction of behavior. And beneath all of this lies a shared architectural principle: continuous feedback loops operating at planetary scale. What Cybersyn attempted manually has become automated, distributed, and invisible. What was once a physical operations room is now a global, decentralized infrastructure embedded in computation, logistics, and communication systems. The irony is not that Cybersyn was ahead of its time. It is that its logic never disappeared. It diffused and reassembled itself in systems too large, too complex, and too fast to be perceived from a single vantage point. The operations room no longer exists. Because it is no longer a room. It is everywhere and nowhere. Which leads to the central question that Cybersyn leaves behind. Not as history, but as structure. If a system can see itself in real time, it begins to behave differently. It becomes more adaptive, more efficient, more responsive, but also more sensitive to control. So the question is not whether such systems should exist. They already do. The question is who defines their boundaries, who controls their feedback, who interprets their signals. When human decision-making becomes slower than the systems it is meant to govern, what happens? Cybersyn was not the beginning of computerized governance. It was the first visible prototype of something that has since become invisible, a transition point between analog administration and continuous computational reality. Today, we live inside the continuation of that transition. Most of it is automated. Most of it is unseen. Most of it is no longer questioned, which leads to the final realization. Project Cybersyn did not end in 1973. It was interrupted and then rebuilt quietly, incrementally, globally across the modern world. The system did not disappear. It scaled. And now the question is no longer what Cybersyn was. The question is what it became, and whether any society can fully understand a system that evolves faster than the people inside it can perceive. Because once a society gains the ability to see itself in real time, it also loses the ability to pretend it is not already changing. How should human beings govern systems too complex for any one person to see? Beneath every dashboard, every algorithm, every real-time network, and every AI model, you can still hear the faint echo of Project Cybersyn, not as a relic of the past, but as an early glimpse of a future that is still unfolding. Every year, networks become larger, data becomes more abundant, and the distance between observation and action continues to shrink. The dream of real-time coordination that seemed almost impossible in 1972 now exists on a planetary scale. Yet the fundamental challenge remains exactly the same. Technology can tell us what is happening. It can even suggest what might happen next. But it cannot tell us what kind of society we should build. That choice still belongs to people. And perhaps that is the final lesson of Cybersyn. The story was never really about computers. It was never about telex machines, or operations rooms, or futuristic chairs. It was about an attempt to navigate complexity without surrendering human agency. An attempt to use technology as a tool for collective understanding rather than simple control. Whether it succeeded is still debated. Whether it could ever have worked is still debated, but the ambition itself remains remarkable, because long before the digital age arrived, before the internet connected billions of people, before algorithms shaped economies, and artificial intelligence entered everyday life, a small team looked at the growing complexity of the modern world and asked a question that still echoes today. If a society could see itself clearly, what would it choose to become? And in many ways, we are still trying to answer it. If you enjoyed this video, consider liking, subscribing, and leaving a comment. It genuinely helps support the time and effort that goes into creating these videos. Sharing it with someone who might find it interesting also makes a bigger difference than you might think. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video.